On behalf of all of us at the Center for Women in Work here at Rutgers University, welcome to this conversation and celebration of Dorothy Sue Cobble's new publication, For the Many, American Feminists and the Global Fight for Democratic Equality. We are honored that the Center is able to host today's conversation about the history and future of the global fight for women's rights and economic justice. We have an accomplished group of scholars here with us, and I know you are looking forward to hearing from each of them. My name is Deborah Lancaster, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Women in Work. To learn more about us, please go to our website and sign up for our newsletter while you're there. As the founder of the Center for Women in Work nearly 27 years ago, Dorothy Sue saw an opportunity to connect scholars and scholarship with advocates, unions, and working people. The programming and collaborations Dorothy Sue began have played all kinds of roles in union representation, coalition building and advocacy, and in shaping policy and scholarship. We are grateful to be able to continue what you started, Dorothy Sue, and are hopeful that these efforts will contribute toward a more just, livable, and kind world. I want to thank Todd Vachon, Director of the Labor Education Action Research Network, and Ludine Doe from our CWW team for doing the critical behind-the-scenes work to make today possible. I would like to thank our co-hosts, including the School of Management and Labor Relations and the Princeton University Press. And we would like to acknowledge all of our wonderful Rutgers co-sponsors, including the Department of History, the Institute for Women's Leadership, CWO, and the Center for Global Work and Employment. A special thank you to Michael Merrill for being a thought partner and resource to us. And I want to thank all of you for being here and ask for your patience should we hit any technical challenges. As we start to get to the substance of this afternoon, a few housekeeping items. The chat feature is disabled for the audience, but as panelists are introduced, we will be posting their bios in the chart for your reference. The audience can post their questions for the panelists in the Q&A feature. We are recording the event. Our panel is chaired by Dr. Deborah Gray-White. Deborah is the Board of Governors Distinguished Professor of History and Women and Gender Studies at Rutgers University. She is a scholar and teacher and the author and editor of numerous books, including Aren't I a Woman?, Female Slaves in the Plantation South, the first gendered analysis of the institution of slavery, and Too Heavy a Load, Black Women in Defense of Themselves. She was co-director of Narratives of Power, New Articulations of Race, Gender, Sexuality, and Class, and a 2-year seminar and conference project with the Rutgers Center for Historical Analysis. Deborah has been instrumental in advancing the Rutgers Scarlet and Black Project, an exploration of the history of race and disenfranchisement here at Rutgers University. Her scholarship and leadership has been recognized through numerous awards and honors. We are honored to have her with us here today. I'll turn it over to you, Deborah.
Thank you, Deborah, for that introduction. And that it gives me great pleasure to moderate this panel, which is both a celebration of the career of Dorothy Sue Cobble and a celebration of her magnificent tour de force for the many, American Feminists and the Global Fight for Democratic Equality. This magnum opus fills so many gaps in both labor and feminist history, while it also shows us the direction that scholarship should take in the future. So we're privileged and honored to be able to be among those taking a first look at this newly conceptualized study of feminism. One of my chores today is to introduce the panel, and I will, of course, start with our illustrious celebrant, Professor Dorothy Sue Cobble, who is a distinguished professor emerita at Rutgers University, where she taught history, labor studies, and women and gender studies for 35 years. She writes on social movements and politics in the United States and globally, with an eye to how the past can help inspire and inform progressive social change. She's the author of multiple award-winning books, including The Other Woman's Movement, Workplace Justice and Social Rights in Modern America, and most recently, of course, what we're here celebrating today, For the Many, American Feminists and the Global Fight for Democratic Equality. Susan Zimmerman is a distinguished professor at the Central European University in Vienna and Budapest. Her most recent monograph is Women's Politics and Men's Trade Unionism, International Gender Politics, Female IFTU Trade Unionists, and the Labor and Women's Movements of the Interwar Period. Since 2014, she served as the president of the International Conference of Labor and Social History. Yvette Richards is an associate professor of history at George Mason University. She's published 2 books, Maida Springer, Pan-Africanist and International Labor, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right, and the oral history companion book entitled Conversations with Maida Springer, A Personal History of Labor, Race, and International Relations. Her current book project analyzes racial violence in Northern Louisiana through the framework of multi-generational and closely connected Black and white family networks. Joan Sanger is the Vanier Professor Emeritus at Trent University in Canada, whose writing includes histories of working class women, the labor movement and the left, the law and criminalization, Indigenous women, and feminist movements. Her recently published book is Demanding Equality, 100 Years of Canadian Feminism. Joanne Meyerowitz is the author, Ubosky Professor of History and American Studies at Yale University. That's a mouthful. Her most recent publication, just out in April, is A War on Global Poverty, the Lost Promise of Redistribution and the Rise of Microcredit. Jocelyn Alcott, she's Professor of History and International Comparative Studies and the Margaret Taylor Smith Director of the program in Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies at Duke University. She's the author of Revolutionary Women in Post-Revolutionary Mexico, and also International Women's Year, the greatest consciousness-raising event in history. Ruth Milkman, as you can see, we've got really quite an array of scholars. In fact, we've got a who's who in women's history and labor history. Ruth Milkman is Distinguished Professor of Sociology at the Graduate Center, CUNY, and the Chair of Labor Studies at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. Her most recent books are On Gender and Labor and Inequality, Immigrant Labor and the New Precariat, and Immigrant Matters. And our last presenter is Nancy Hewitt, who is Distinguished Professor Emerita at Rutgers University, where she taught history and women and gender studies, and followed Dorothy Sue Cobble as director of the Institute for Research on Women. She's published widely on women's activism in the United States, including Radical Friend, Amy Kirby Post and Her Activist Worlds, the edited volume, No Permanent Waves, Recasting Histories of US Feminism, and 2 editions of A Companion to American Women's History. As I said before, we've got really quite an illustrious group here. Dorothy, I'm gonna let you have the first word.
Okay, thanks, Deborah. Can everybody hear me? Yes, okay, great. Thanks so much, Deborah, for moderating today. And thanks, Deb Lancaster, the Center for Women in Work, and the other sponsors and hosts who made this event possible. I wanted to thank, too, the incredible women sharing the screen with me. I've depended heavily on the scholarship of each of them in writing my new book, and it is really thrilling for me to have them all gathered here in one place. I know there's also many of you in the audience, I wish I could see you, who taught me a great deal over the years and have really been terrific colleagues and friends. So thank you for that, and thank you for being here today. My new book sails out into the world this week with many hopes, and I thought I would share just 4 of them. First, I wanted to call attention to the long and wide stream of US women's egalitarian social democratic politics. It's a tradition I call full rights feminism. This tradition, I argue, is more robust than we have imagined, with full rights feminists in the forefront of shifting US political culture to the left, remaking the US Democratic Party, and enacting civic, workplace, and legislative reforms of lasting value. It is a rich, relevant past, I think, with much to teach about how to confront the challenges of our time. Rising authoritarianism and corporate power, stark economic and racial inequalities, the crisis of care and neglect of the commons, the dehumanization and demonization of the other. The solutions to these problems offered by the women and for the many, though partial, I believe can help navigate a way forward. Second, I wanted to foreground the ideas and leadership of working class women, a diverse group by race, culture, and citizenship. And that meant shining the flashlight into corners sometimes ignored in the histories of feminism. So studying the International Labor Organization, for example, or the huge international trade union federations, which are arguably the largest NGOs in the 20th century, or paying more attention to worker education sites like the industrial clubs of the Y or the Bryn Mawr Summer School for working women. Third, I hope to contribute to our ongoing collective effort to rethink the conventional frameworks and narratives of feminist history in light of the diversity of women's lives and desires. And I hope this is a subject that we can return to in the Q&A. Suffice it to say for now, though, that I chose the phrase full rights because it captured the desire of social democratic feminists for the full array of rights, economic and social, as well as political and civil. I also use it, as did they, to distinguish their politics from an equal rights tradition of feminism that conceived of women's rights narrowly as formal, legal equality between men and women. Full rights feminists wanted more. They believed women's freedom required dismantling multiple structures of exploitation. Fourth, last but not least, I wanted to globalize the story of US feminism and understand it as a movement shaped by global events, ideas, and peoples. Feminism did not start here and go elsewhere. It started everywhere and came here. American feminism is a global product. It sprang from the foreign-born and the native-born, from citizen and non-citizen, from sojourners who stayed for days or years, and from those who never set foot inside US borders. Australia's Alice Henry, Sweden's Sigrid Ekendahl, or India's Ella Bhatt shaped US women's movements, just as did Polish immigrant Rose Schneiderman or Panamanian-bred Maida Springer. For the Many is about transnational connections and misconnections, about bonds broken and frayed, as well as solidarities forged and sustained. I open with a dramatic story of the first International Federation of Working Women in 1919 and US women's efforts alongside their labor and socialist counterparts abroad to shape the first set of global labor standards, including the first and very important ILO Convention on the Rights of Pregnant Women and Mothers. I then follow the thread of US women's social democratic politics over the next 100 years as it winds south and north, east and west. It's a multi-generational network of women who drew inspiration from labor struggles and social welfare experiments in Australia, Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean. They learned as well from anti-colonial movements, especially those in Asia and Africa. The women I profile in For the Many did not always live up to their own ideals, nor did they achieve all they hoped for or anticipated. And as we know, social democratic reform, especially after the 1940s, gained greater traction elsewhere than in the US. Yet, as I write in the epilogue, a new politics of the many is thriving once again, seeking to extend the progressive vision full rights feminists help sustain. Dynamic and creative female-led movements are on the move in the US and around the world, premised on social solidarity, inclusion, and equity. I'll stop here and I'll pass the baton to my extraordinary co-panelists to share some of their findings and perspectives. Their insights are everywhere in For the Many, and I'm immensely grateful to them. Thank you.
So our first panelist is Susan Zimmerman.
Yes, thank you, first of all, Dorothy Sue, for inviting me to contribute to this book presentation. I feel truly honored. And I will use my 5 to 6 minutes to highlight 2 contributions of For the Many that I consider particularly innovative. And I will illustrate or aim to illustrate this view as per Dorothy Sue's aviso, with information about, quote, interwar activism of European labor and socialist women. Key in my reading of For the Many is, first of all, its contribution to fully historicizing socialist women's activism. In the prologue of For the Many, the history of a century of full rights feminism is summarized as moving, quote, in fits and starts, with tragic detours and dispiriting defeats alongside celebrations and gains, unquote. Yet, For the Many does more than disrupting both protagonists and historians' traditional perceptions of progress towards gender equity and gender justice through women's activism. In addition, we learn about the full range of political negotiation, or else the wide array of specific and historically changing contexts and politics, actors, and institutions that have been involved in framing labor women's activism in the 20th century. I myself learned the same lesson, namely that restoring multiple and complex contexts to the history of socialist trade union women's activism is crucial when I did the research on the small group of European social democratic women who formed the women's branch of the International Federation of Trade Unions, the IFTU, in the interwar period. Let me give you one example. The Bourgogne research on activist women's involvement with the League of Nations doesn't talk much about socialist women. Still, I took a last-minute decision in autumn 2019 to see the League's archives in Geneva with the aim to at least do a double check. What I found was a pronounced multi-level relationship between the IFTU women and the League. Importantly, this resulted not simply in adding additional pages to the book, detailing, for instance, that it was the IFTU women who brought the issue of the so-called illegitimate children to the League of Nations and made it stay there for many, many years. The sources kept in the League of Nations archives also greatly helped me to fully develop the argument about how the emerging new emphasis and the broadening of the concept of women's politics at both the League of Nations and the ILO had a decisive impact throughout the 1930s on the gendered labor politics pursued by the IFTU women and the IFTU as a whole, and on the shifting use of concepts such as equality or protection. For the Many masterfully builds into its narrative of social democratic women's internationalism the multi-layered contexts, shifts, and connections that gave this activism its historical shape. A second key contribution of For the Many in my reading concerns the fact that full rights feminism, with all its complex and multidimensional agendas, still put material issues, economic inequality and economic reform center stage. Dorothy Sue argues convincingly that her protagonists challenged economic inequality both within the United States and between the richer and the poorer nations. They thus put the connection between both class in its more traditional sense and global material inequality on the one hand, and gender on the other at the core of their agenda. US American full rights feminism thus embodies the long-term history of the entanglement of gender politics and the politics of economic equality on a global scale. This global outlook sharply sets apart the US American full rights feminists from their European trade union sisters working within the IFTU. Early on, the British Mary Quayle suggested that the IFTU women's branch should pursue agitation among women in countries not yet affiliated to the Amsterdam International, such as Japan, China, and India. Yet, the IFTU leadership instantly declared this impossible. The IFTU women obeyed, and in all the subsequent years of activity remained sworn to a focus on the European industrialized countries. I would argue that this difference invites us to study more thoroughly the reasons why, to which degree, and how social democratic women in and from different world regions went global in the short 20th century. In my reading of For the Many, the connection between the fact that this was the period of US American global economic and political hegemony on the one hand, and US American women's pronounced global engagement on the other, peeks out over and over again from the pages of For the Many, even whilst many of the full rights feminists spoke out against features and implications of that hegemony time and again. How has the connection between global hegemony and dominance shaped the internationalism of social democratic women from world regions beyond Europe and the American continent? A lot of research needs to be done, I would argue, to fully historicize the international dimensions of full rights feminism from around the world. For the Many takes an important step in this direction. Thanks.
Should I begin? Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dorothy Sue, for inviting me to be on this illustrious panel. I'm very excited to celebrate your latest work. I'm going to talk to you all today about Maida Springer and her connection to Pan-Africanism, the decolonization movement, and to transnational feminism. She is part of this collective biography that Dorothy Sue Cobble has written of women activists who embrace full rights feminism. Women's equality and women's leadership were fundamental to her activism. She was nurtured by a strong line of women in her family. Among the other female influences in her life were women from the labor movement, Vanya Cohn, Pauline Newman, Dolly Luther Robinson, Charlotte Edelman, and Esther Peterson. She was also very good friends with Pauline Murray, a giant in the civil rights and women's movements. Rising to business agent position in the garment workers before becoming an international representative for the AFL-CIO, Springer blossomed in a movement that afforded her so many opportunities to expand her talents, but she also bridled at the blatant racism she faced. She said that racism was on so many levels that it made you itch. I think the extent that Springer was effective in her labor work in African countries during decolonization was due to her ability to outwit her opposition by keeping cool and studying their ways. When she first heard in West Africa the Anansi, the spider folktales that had been passed down in her own family through her African-born enslaved great-grandmother, she remarked that her hair stood on end. In many ways, she embodied attributes of the wily spider, Anansi, able to outwit stronger opponents. Springer had many teachers along the way. In her early labor activism, Smoila Margolin taught her how to be informed and challenging instead of angry and incoherent when dealing with management. She learned from A. Philip Randolph and Mary McLeod Bethune the importance of turning resentment against racism toward furthering your goals. She learned from George Padmore the history of empire, and through him and Una Marson became connected to the Pan-African network of people, some fighting in World War II and all planning the fight for independence. She learned early that representation mattered, it had consequences, and should be protected from being used to cause harm to what she saw as larger goals. In colonial East Africa, where she oversaw a scholarship program for union representatives to study in the United States, she had to be extremely careful with the colonial British officials who were itching for an excuse to throw her out of the region. She also learned that the US consul there was in league with them. She later privately told him off without raising her voice. How she dealt with sexism and sexist thinking from African labor leaders was situational. Josiah T. Maluleke, a labor leader in Southern Rhodesia, who was happy to learn that a Black woman like Springer was high up in union leadership, nevertheless supported a gendered hierarchical thinking about labor. While suffering for 2 years in isolation and detention, he wrote her about the physical difficulty of getting water and carrying water, and ended the description by saying that the work was also humiliating because it was woman's work. Although Springer's general tone was sympathetic, she lightly upbraided him on the water labor issue. The goal, it seems to me, she said, is to evolve an economic society in which technology would release males and females from much of the existing unhealthy and arduous tasks, a society in which the minds of men and women would be more fully utilized for thinking, learning, and thereby producing justice, equality, and economic stability. On the other hand, she threatened to upend the Institute of Tailoring and Cutting, a project in Kenya she had poured years of labor into making a reality if Kenyan labor leaders didn't agree to equal pay for the one-woman teacher. After her tirade, they agreed to equal pay. I'd like to end the talk by talking about her relationship with Tom Mboya, whom she called her second son, and talk about their legacy. Although he and Springer kept in friendly contact, the relationship became somewhat strained after the Cold War political pressures forced him to distance himself from Americans. A few months before Mboya's assassination in 1969, Springer arrived in Kenya to a rather urgent message that he wanted to speak to her. For the rest of her life, it haunted her as she never knew what he wanted to say. He had to leave the country for a meeting soon after her arrival, and their brief meeting in the airport was quickly dashed by the presence of an assortment of African ministers who were happy to see and speak with Maida Springer. The last person Mboya spoke to on the streets before his assassination was Obama Sr., who had been a part of the student airlift that Mboya largely helped to make possible, and which indirectly led to the birth of the 44th president of the United States. In 2015, President Obama took a picture with others on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and I'll just share with you this picture. On one side of Obama is Representative John Lewis. On the other side, he holds hands with civil rights leader Amelia Boynton. And next to her is Dr. Adelaide L. Sanford, a celebrated educator and activist. And here is Jan Robinson McCrae. She's also an educator. She's a goddaughter of Maida Springer and the daughter of labor leader Dolly Luther Robinson, who was also head of the New York Labor Department and the US Department of Labor as an assistant, and was in the US Department of Labor as assistant to Esther Peterson, the highest ranking member in JFK's administration. This photo highlights the connecting legacies of civil rights, decolonization, Pan-Africanism, education, and women's rights. The breadth of Maida Springer's work with full rights feminism animates these connections. And I thank you, Dorothy Sue Cobble, for including her in your book so prominently.
Thank you so much for that. Our next speaker is Joan Sangster.
Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here today to pay tribute to Dorothy Sue's masterful and path-breaking narrative of American and international feminism, a book with immense breadth and depth, reflecting her impeccably high standards of scholarship, scholarly engagement, and lively writing. But I especially want to pay tribute today to Dorothy Sue as a scholar, an international scholar whose friendship, generosity, and engagement with those of us outside of the US has been so important. Writing transnational histories has unique challenges, trying to bring together the subnational, national, and global as shifting interactive categories, appreciating multiple political cultures and international relations without ever losing sight of those women making history on the ground, and understanding global circuits of ideas as many balls in the air. And Dorothy Sue has done all of this with incredible aplomb. It is a major achievement. Transnational histories do vary based on our location, political and national. So I want to use the rest of my time with a few brief examples of Canadian transnationalism, but drawing out themes from Dorothy Sue's book. And I'm keying off also a scene in Armando Iannucci's satirical film In the Loop, which I hope some of you have seen, about American and British diplomats and their high-level skirmishes as they organize a meeting in Washington. And at one point, one says to the other, oh, the Canadians are going to be at the table, what we do with them? And the other side says, oh, don't worry, they're so thrilled to be invited, we don't need to worry about them. Well, there's something actually a little true in that, because Canadian feminists were not so much in the loop in terms of the leadership of international organizations, but they were very much in the loop in terms of transnational ideas. So I'm going to give you just a few examples. Transnational ideas, as the book shows, encouraged feminists to argue reforms in their own country that they saw abroad, sometimes using international organizations to shame their politicians. In the interwar period, English-Canadian liberal feminists, many still enamored with British imperialism, tried to use a Commonwealth group, the British Dominion Women's Citizenship Union, to shame the Quebec government into giving women the vote, since Quebec, like France, lagged behind. Canadians weren't in the leadership of this organization, but they used speeches and their resolutions to urge Quebec to join the, quote, civilized world of women's rights. Well, this shaming effort laid bare English-French tensions within the country and actually a certain Anglo-ethnocentrism at the time, and it didn't actually help the suffrage struggle. But what I found actually interesting reading those minutes was that Australian women used the very same organization to shame their government, but about the removal of Indigenous children from their families. Canadian feminists were quiet on that one. Second organization example from the same time period. International organizations always gave feminists kind of courage in their lonely political battles at home, including in the 30s, Canadian socialist feminist pacifists. The Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, of course, innovated by arguing that peace could only be constructed on the basis of economic, gender, and racial justice. The US-based WIL exposed American imperialism in Latin America and was critical of racism. And however limited some of those efforts were, the example really mattered. Canadian WILers then took courage from this anti-racism, critiquing British imperialism and also significantly the anti-Asian voting exclusions that existed in British Columbia. Some of these women were former suffragists who didn't take up those issues previously, but now they did, given this courage of the international organization. And taking up these issues, especially when they ran for office, was actually very unpopular. Voting rights for Asian Canadians was unpopular in BC, to say the least. Third, feminist internationalism could inspire equality, reciprocity, a struggle for human rights, but we also know the sometimes more divisive things, including the Cold War politics of the 1950s. It also revealed tensions within and between nation states. So my last example, again, draws on Dorothy Sue's book. As she shows, new feminist organizing in the 1960s drew on anti-imperialist and left-wing feminist views. When Americans co-organized conferences in Canada in 1969 and 1971 against the Vietnam War, there were, of course, good intentions, but also tensions, not necessarily with the Indo-Chinese, but between the Canadians and Americans. Now, as an aside, one of the most productive parts of this tension was the first Canadian graphic novel. There was a feminist history of Canada called She Named It Canada, which was written to, quote, educate the Americans, but actually has lived on as a very witty history. Despite this tension between Canadians and Americans, if you skip ahead to the 1975 Mexico UN meeting, the tension was actually far greater between feminists themselves from Canada. And these were ideological tensions. Liberal Party women were determined to prevent a resolution in 1975, which condemned imperialism and settler dispossession, while left-wing anti-imperialist Canadian women at the same meeting vigorously campaigned for it. So in that instance, there was far more tension internally. To one group, an analysis of imperialism was absolutely essential to feminism. To the other Canadian group, it was not. So just to conclude, all these complex layered power relations, ideological differences that divided and at the same time united transnational feminists, feminists' different national and political starting points are, and their shifting goals over time are all at the heart of this wonderful book. It is, I think, a model of research excellence, but it's also something more to those of us that are transnational feminists. A reminder that the global fight is not over and still very much worth pursuing. So thank you, Dorothy Sue, for reminding us about that. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Joanne Meyerowitz is our next speaker.
Thank you, Deborah. I'm going to join the chorus here and just say congratulations to Dorothy Sue. For the Many is just a sweeping magisterial history, as Deborah said earlier, a magnum opus that really pushes us to rethink the history of 20th century feminism and to remember its democratic promise. So I've known Dorothy Sue for lots of years, since we were in graduate school together at Stanford, and we launched our doctoral research together in a seminar taught by Estelle Friedman. Dorothy Sue was writing about women labor organizers in California, and I was writing about the women's worker education movement. And since that time, I've learned from Dorothy Sue about the expanding circles of working class feminists, labor feminists, and now full rights feminists. And after all these years, we've both published books this spring, and they have some interesting overlaps. My new book, A War on Global Poverty, looks at US involvement in campaigns against global poverty in the 1970s and 1980s, and how those campaigns came to see poor women overseas as the deserving poor. In the 1970s, development experts, and that's who I study, moved to the left, rejected trickle-down economics, and turned their attention away from national economic growth and toward the redistribution of wealth, redistribution both between nations and within them. And as this happened, a new women in development movement, which was inspired by the rising interest in global poverty and also by feminism, demanded that women be included, not primarily as mothers, but as income-earning workers. The phrase used then in the 70s was income generators. Women were to be income generators. And in the more conservative 1980s, this combined interest in poverty and women came together in the development trend of microcredit, which is, I'm sure you know, provides tiny loans to poor women intended to make them entrepreneurs. In the neoliberal 1980s, this represented a retreat from redistribution and a turn to privatized, market-oriented business development, but it sustained the interest in poverty and in women. So Dorothy Sue's book and my book overlap in the women in development movement, which Dorothy Sue notes in her last chapter. And as I was writing, she reminded me more than once, that some feminists had addressed the labor of women in the global South well before the 1970s. And that's an important point. In fact, some of the women who feature in Dorothy Sue's earlier chapters reappear in the 1970s Women in Development movement. Take Clara Beyer, for example, who had a ridiculously long career as a full rights feminist, from her work on the minimum wage for women in the 19-teens to her success in 1973 at the age of 81 in changing US foreign aid legislation to explicitly include women in economic development efforts. Or to give another example, take Dorothy Height, the longtime president of the National Council of Negro Women, who was an avid supporter of the Women in Development movement and testified on behalf of it before Congress. Her organization won one of the first US government grants given to support the international Women in Development effort. But the Women in Development movement was also something of a departure from earlier full rights feminism. It grew out of a different context, and most of its advocates were outside of the circles that Dorothy Sue addresses. They devoted less energy to women's wage work, labor standards, and labor unions, and more to rural poverty and women's work in the informal economy. And by the end of the 1970s, they'd managed to work their way into new offices and programs in foundations, governments, international organizations, NGOs, and universities. In the US, they founded programs in the mainstream in USAID, the Peace Corps, the Ford Foundation, and the World Bank, among others. And like most social movements, the Women in Development movement was fractious. There were fault lines, as Joan has just told us, between liberal feminists who dominated in government agencies in the US and US left feminists who dominated in universities. In the US, the politics of the movement's supporters ran from moderate Republican to Marxist feminists. And there were fault lines between the Women in Development advocates in the global North and those in the global South, who often had sharp critiques of US and European imperialism and longstanding suspicion of US women who assumed that they had leadership roles. And those divisions persisted in the 1980s with activists, mainly from the left and global South, who wanted a radical revision of gender, class, and national hierarchies, and other women in development advocates who turned in the 1980s to more minimal programs that encouraged business development. Clara Beyer and Dorothy Height, those women who were schooled in that longer full rights feminist tradition that Dorothy Sue tells us so much about, they were among the US women who were more successful in bridging those divides. So they're worth remembering, as Dorothy Sue tells us, for their commitment to substantive equality across the board, and also for the ways they bridged the divides and connected the generations. Thanks, and congratulations again, Dorothy Sue.
Jocelyn Alcott.
Thank you. I want to join everyone in congratulating Dorothy Sue and saying what an honor it is to be on this panel. I have to say I was intimidated already just to join this panel, and then I made the mistake of looking at the attendees list, and it's this is a really impressive crowd you've drawn out here, Dorothy Sue. And just to point out that I am still angry at the guy in grad school who stole my copy of Ava Barron's work in Gendered. So it's really amazing to see her name pop up here. I should also tell you that I am joining you from the unceded tribal territories of the First Nations, including Haliwa-Saponi, Tuscarora, Waccamaw-Siouan, and Catawba peoples, and many others here in North Carolina that are still struggling to get their land back. So along with books such as Judy Wu's Radicals on the Road, Catherine Marino's Feminism for the Americas, and most recently, Joan Meyrowitz's A War on Global Poverty, I think we're seeing a really exciting historiographical revival of transnational women's history. Importantly, scholars such as Francisca de Haan, Michelle Chase, Kristen Godsey, and Chiara Bonafiglia are helping us see the critical role also that socialist countries and women in socialist countries that I think we long saw as kind of state-captured socialist feminists have played in building networks that included not only women from the East, but also women from the global South. As Joan Sangster just pointed out, these different feminisms often do not obey the national geopolitical boundary markers that we anticipate for them. And I think that we see this also in Dorothy Sue's wonderful book. I'm currently researching to the extent that pandemic restrictions and other commitments allow, I am researching a subset of what Dorothy Sue dubs full rights feminists. These are, I think, as Joan Meyerich has pointed out, a kind of foundations that she historicizes for us. In particular, global South-based women's networks that emerged out of the UN women's conferences of the 1970s and 80s, particularly groups such as Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, better known as DAWN, and the Encuentros Feministas Latinoamericanas y del Caribe, which most people refer to as the Encuentros Feministas or the Feminist Encounters. And much like the women who populate For the Many, the women who formed these networks were difficult to pigeonhole ideologically. They rejected nationalist approaches, and they often favored the democratic processes, even when they were, as Dorothy Sue points out, messy and frustrating. Indeed, the Encuentros Feministas seem to eagerly invite that messiness as part of their ethos, cultivating what I've come to think of as a dissensus feminism. Participants in these networks ran the gamut from the more educated and professionalized members of the policymaking set to the burn it down activists who challenged not only the patriarchy, but also what they called historical feminists, whom they saw as clinging to outmoded priorities for the feminist struggle. In between these two were a host of creatives, organizers, intellectuals, NGO professionals, etc. Much like the women who we come to know and For the Many, the women who formed these networks advocated for practices and policies that centered around an ethos of care rather than of rights. That is to say, they focused on concerns about sustaining communities, ecologies, cultures, and households. Much like women such as Mary MacArthur, Frida Miller, and Esther Peterson, whom Dorothy Sue talks about, who advocated for recognizing care work as a skilled craft and for using public policies to address what remains of the crisis of care. These activists also wanted to point to the time, labor, attention, and expertise that were required for maintaining all kinds of care labors. And again, not just the labors of social reproduction, but all kinds of community and cultural and ecological care. One of Dawn's founders, Gita Sen, recounted the network's early efforts to describe a feminism that did not center on liberal notions of rights and individual equality, but rather a thoroughgoing restructuring of local and international political economies. The question at the time, as Sen recalled, was, quote, what is the point of arguing for a larger share of a poisoned pie? We particularly see Dawn's influence on an engagement with Dorothy Sue's full rights feminists in her description of the relationship in Dorothy Sue's description of the relationship between Gloria Steinem and Dawn founder Devaki Jain. I think it's worth noting Devaki Jain shows up in Joanne's book as well as my book on International Women's Year. And I think we're starting to get a recognizable cast of characters in this historiography, which seems like a sign of its maturity and its robustness, but also perhaps for us a cautionary signal about whose stories are making it into the archives and then into our books. But one last thing I wanted to highlight, a development that falls just beyond the scope of Dorothy Sue's book, but that underscores the importance of the history that she's telling us. In 2019, the ILO's Future of Work publication centered largely on care work and the importance, as they put it, of a human-centered agenda. This is a campaign that is quite explicitly building upon all of that struggle that Dorothy Sue documents in For the Many, and allows us to see the way that this diverse group of women laid the intellectual and political groundwork that allows us to finally tackle head-on the crisis of care with all of the racial and gender inequity that it has fostered. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Our next speaker is Ruth Milkman.
Hi, everyone. It's such an honor to be part of this amazing panel. And also I agree with what was just said about, what Jocelyn just said about the participants. So it's nice to see all these friends and colleagues. Like Joanne, I've known Dorothy.
Oh, no.
Series of contributions. I'm particularly fond of the very first one, Dishing It Out, that I'm sure many of you know. So toward the end of For the Many, Dorothy Sue mentions some research I did recently on a new political generation of feminists, and that's what I'm going to share a little bit about in my remarks right now. So I'm going to try to share my screen, and I have a few slides to show you. Let's see if this works. Can you guys see this? So I think everyone here is aware that recent social movements, we've had a wave of new social movements since the crash of 2008, led by what I like to call a new political generation, often called millennials and now Generation Z. And in my view, they embody a new variation on Dorothy Sue's full rights feminism. In their terms, though, that's, they call it a commitment to intersectionality, which is not exactly the same maybe, but very similar. Another thing I found in my own research on this is that in this cycle of protest, not just in the new feminism, but in other social movements like those mentioned in the slide, women and also notably LGBTQ people are disproportionately represented among the leaders. So I'm just going to race through this since I have so little time, but that's the basic message. More generally, young women in the United States, and I'm the provincialist here, I'm only talking about the United States, though I think these movements have connections to similar movements elsewhere. Young women generally are more engaged in activism than young men in the United States, and I think that's historically unprecedented, though you will correct me if I'm wrong, on multiple fronts. So this is just a little slide that shows some evidence of that. And a few examples, I think you all are familiar with this. The climate movement has a disproportionately female presence. You remember her from the Parkland movement. And of course, the Squad, who we all know and admire, or at least speaking for myself. So where did this all come from? What I try to show in the research I've done on this is that there are sort of three distinct things that provoked the emergence of this movement. One is simply the internet revolution. These women and their male counterparts, and for that matter, their non-binary counterparts, are digital natives. They, unlike most of us on this panel, they grew up with what we think of as new technology, and this enables their activism and in some cases networks them with other movements around the globe. The other thing I think that propelled this generation into activism is the transformation of the labor market, and especially the fact that while they're the most educated generation in this country's history, they are often facing, well, the post-crash of 2008 labor market. Many are underemployed or precariously employed, even though they are highly educated and, of course, carrying enormous debt. And this generation is marked by disappointment. Having grown up being told that they lived in a post-racial society, they see police murdering people in the African-American community, especially all around them. Having been told that they live in a post-feminist world, they see sexual assault and experience it. This generation also is more diverse in racial and ethnic terms than any of its predecessors, and a larger share identify as bisexual, queer, transgender, whatever. They're also the most highly educated generation in this country's history, and they're far more progressive politically than previous generations, especially among those with college education and among millennials of color. So this is just a glimpse of a few issues on which you can see those political tendencies. Again, I don't really have time to get into the details. You probably have seen this. This generation were the sort of front lines of the Bernie supporters, and many embrace socialism and denounce capitalism explicitly. In terms of the feminist piece of this, I think it begins with the anti-sexual assault movement on campuses that later expanded into Me Too. That developed alongside other kinds of campus activism. And again, intersectionality is central to the political framework that these activists have adopted. And some actually see themselves as socialist feminists, as some of us on this panel did in another protest wave. well, maybe we can talk about that more later. Many of them, and this is crucial for what I've tried to document, are active in other movements as well. So a couple examples. One is the Dreamers, that's the young immigrants fighting for legal status for those who are brought here as kids. Veronica Terricas has shown that the leaders of this movement are disproportionately female and disproportionately LGBTQ. And then Black Lives Matter is another case of this. This is some data I gathered on Black Lives Matter in its first round of in 20, out of the Ferguson events a few years ago in 2016. So as you can see here, and this is a long story how we got this data, which I can talk about more, you can read about it. But as you can see, women are the majority, highly educated women are the majority of leaders in this, and activists in this movement, and a majority are actually LGBTQ. And finally, the labor movement, which I didn't write about in the article that Dorothy Sue quotes, but seems fitting to end with that. Women lead many so-called alt-labor organizations, worker centers, and other non-union labor groups. They also have a growing presence in traditional unions. And I didn't put that in the slide about political attitudes, but this generation is much more pro-union than older folks are. And unions are cool again with this generation, is what we're seeing in all the survey data. And I think if, as some people now believe, labor is on the cusp of some new wave of organizing, this generation will be central to it. I see that I'm out of time, so I'll just stop there. Thanks.
Okay, our last speaker, Nancy Hewitt, is going to summarize and try to bring us all together. And I'd like to remind everyone that you can, if you've already formulated a question, please put it in the question and answer function, and so we can jump right into our questions when Nancy Hewitt finishes. Nancy.
Thanks, Deborah. My terrific co-panelists have wielded insights from their own research to highlight the ways that Cobble's wonderful new book, For the Many, transforms our thinking about how American women, especially feminists, pushed, and I quote Dorothy Sue here, the nation and the world towards justice and greater equality for all. Their comments have tracked this process chronologically and thematically across the 20th and early 21st century, as does Cobble's book. My role is to highlight some issues threaded through For the Many and some of the panelists' comments as well, which I didn't see before this. So of course I was making some assumptions about what you might talk about. Most of the panelists and Drs. Cobble and White received our graduate training in the 1970s and or early 80s. Over the past 4 decades, we've seen studies of women, gender, and sexuality explode across the academy. I use the term explode to emphasize the powerful energy these studies released and the conflict and contention they ignited among scholars. Indeed, the conceptual shift from studying women to studying women, gender, and sexuality was one of those explosive moments, at least in the United States. The field has been transformed in several critical ways that are beautifully illustrated by For the Many. Cobble fully embraces the increasingly complex ways we think about race, ethnicity, nationality, class, and community, and analyzing women and especially women's activism. The participants in this event, and many of you joining us on Zoom, have shaped this more inclusive view of women's past, which has invigorated the field, even as this too engendered heated debates. But my question is, have we reached a new era in this effort to recognize differences among women, even for those of us who highlight cross-class, interracial, and international alliances? Another key issue addressed by panelists involves the shifting definitions of the concepts of equality, democracy, and feminism. Cobble analyzes these debates beginning in the early 20th century as those she labels full rights feminists challenged leaders of the National Women's Party and others whose priorities they believed would harm working class women and ignore women of color. Full rights feminists insisted on the necessity of cross-class and interracial coalitions to fight for rights for all women and for men. Indeed, working class and Black women and women of color, more generally, like Maida Springer, emerged as critical leaders in conceptualizing this human rights vision and fighting for its realization alongside allies in the Americas, South Asia, and the Pacific region. How does For the Many help us then understand the shifting and competing definitions of these terms in new ways? Cobble and our panelists also highlight the complex interplay between the programs and policies implemented by formal institutions, organizations, and governments, and those demanded by community-based, local, and grassroots movements. Although we often think of these in hierarchical terms, politics from above and below, Cobble and several panelists illustrate the ways that boundaries between the two are constantly shifting as successful grassroots movements become institutionalized and as different levels of government contend with each other and with mass movements for social change. So how might we reimagine the concept of politics from above and below? Of course, these issues are increasingly shaped and complicated by historians of US women's growing engagement with hemispheric, international, and global perspectives and actors. In doing so, we are aided by the rich and compelling work of scholars rooted in other areas of the world and by US scholars who study those regions, including 3 on our panel today. As we reach across borders, we are forced to reconsider US conceptions of race, class, family, nationality, gender, and sexuality. Definitions of equality, democracy, and feminism similarly change not only across time, but also across place. And the boundaries between grassroots organizations and governmental bodies becomes especially challenging when we add international governmental and non-governmental organizations to the mix. For instance, Cobble traces India's Self-Employed Women's Association, the Bangladeshi Independent Garment Workers Union, and the US-based Domestic Workers United as they develop from local movements to national and global associations, demanding change from international corporations, national and international governing bodies, and NGOs. How do such groups transform the political landscape and our understandings of women's activism? Finally, the increasingly global focus of 20th century US scholars brings into sharp relief the ways that policies devised in the United States, even some originating with social justice activists and feminists, such as those surrounding women in development, can inhibit rather than advance equality, democracy, and feminism abroad. Too often, US policymakers and some activists have failed to fully comprehend the circumstances, priorities, and resources of those they seek to assist. In some cases, the women we hope to raise up may instead rise up, turning American rhetoric and claims against ill-conceived programs and policies. So what can we learn from such unsuccessful efforts? And how might the cross-class, interracial, and transnational alliances forged by Cobble's full rights feminists help us plot a new path? On that note, I'm going to turn the event back to Professor White so that we have plenty of time for discussion.
Okay, thank you so much. So we are really moving along here, and it's already 3:06. So I'm wondering let's give our panelists and particularly Dorothy Sue, if you would like to respond to any of the questions or issues that Nancy Hewitt raises before we open it up to our attendees. Does anyone have this? I was going to go over the questions again, but I don't want to take up valuable time. So is anything that Professor Hewitt just said that just makes you want to respond? You'd have to unmute yourself to do that. Unmute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, well, you can see that I would not have been able to write this book without the scholarship of all the people who just spoke. And I really encourage you to read their wonderful books, new and old. There are many of them, and they're very worthwhile. And I just want to thank them again for being here and reading the book and helping me with it. Nancy, I'm not surprised she raised some really probing, complicated, interesting questions. And I would love to hear other people respond to some of these things. I had one thing I wanted to add or to take up, and it's just really to say that one of the aims really is to show that American policies are not just devised solely in the US. So that one of the lessons for today really to draw from these women is how much we can learn from others. And I really admired them because they didn't see the US as a model. They were trying to emphasize what Esther Peterson called mutual assistance. We're not alone, and we can't achieve much by ourselves. And I think that's true for individuals and for countries, and certainly the problems, we face in the world. One short note on the Self-Employed Women's Association, since Nancy brought that up, and I know Joanne writes about it and many other people have, and I think it's one of the best examples of how, at least in the more recent times, but this is true really for decades, the US and particularly the US labor movement has a lot to learn from movements outside the US. The Self-Employed Women's Association in India is pretty much, I don't know, the largest union in the world. It ranks with Germans, IG Metall. It's huge. And I think they have something to teach us about how we deal with difference and collectivity. I met the education director of SEVA in part because the School of Management and Labor Relations works with her closely, and I was able to go to Peru where there was a conference. And she was just very eloquent about how they had to start with how all of us are different, and all of us need to recognize and know ourselves and our strengths. But at the same time, to build a movement, you have to figure out what we have in common. And they emphasized what they call work sisters, because they thought the workplace was one arena and one way of thinking beyond caste and race and religion. And I think that's really important. The last and other thing I'll say about them is they move beyond the workplace, and they have a movement that addresses land reform, cooperatives, credit, and political unionism. Their strategy is not to get people to change jobs, but to have those jobs have all the benefits and pay as any other decent job. So I'll just stop there, and I'd be happy to say more about other questions. I'm really interested in other people's thoughts.
Okay. I'm going to go to the Q&A and ask Anna Friesen if she would like to answer the question, if she would like to ask the question. Would you like to ask the question live? Okay, I'm not getting an answer. So I will read the question to move right along. So she asked, labor feminists all over the world have always been particularly attentive to and effective to address non-traditional and overexploited forms of labor that historically involve women more often than men, such as care and domestic work, cottage industry, etc. Do you think that this ability would be used to deal with current neoliberal, increasingly precarious, dispersed, and unregulated forms of labor? And if so, do you think that new generations of labor leadership, still male dominated in many sectors and countries, are able and willing to acknowledge the value of such perspectives and embrace them? Wow, that's a big one. So I'm going to throw that out to all of our panelists, and make sure you unmute yourself when you respond. Any answers? Any takers?
I'll just say a little bit about it, if that's okay. I mean, I think I alluded to this in my brief comments before. The so-called alt labor movement, made up of worker centers that advocate for workers that are overwhelmingly low wage, often foreign born, often women, though not always. That is an arena in which women's leadership has flourished, and they disproportionately are the executive directors and whatnot of these organizations, in strong contrast to traditional unions. I mean, a cynic might point out, as I have sometimes, that this is partly because those jobs don't pay anything compared to being a union president or something. But nevertheless, I think it does carry on the tradition that the question pointed to. And Domestic Workers United is just probably the most famous example, but there are tons of others. Restaurant Opportunity Center, and interestingly, the taxi workers organizations too, which even though the drivers are overwhelmingly male, the women tend to lead those organizations. So anyway, I could go on, and I can't really say much about what's going on elsewhere in the world, but that's the US story. I think your question is, the answer is yes, in this country anyway.
I can jump in on that. The Economist about 3 or 4 years ago had this issue called the left sex, and they said that was women, right? And I don't think we need to think about women's politics in that kind of essentialist way, but I do think because women have been expected to care and have been socially situated with those kinds of responsibilities, and for many other reasons, they have developed a different kind of politics. And I think it's important for us to be able to talk about that over time. And I'm sort of with Naomi Klein when she says, we need a politics of care and repair. And women are rising to the occasion. And that's part of what I tried to argue in the book. An important point about the international labor movement today, Anna, you ask about labor leaders. Well, a lot of them are women. It's not just that women are at the base now. They've moved into really top positions. So the largest international trade union federation in the world, which has, I don't know, millions and millions of members, is headed by an Australian woman, Sharon Barrow. And many of its largest affiliates are actually headed by women, and the majority of the members are women. So I think we're going to see a new politics emerging, sort of to echo what Ruth said, both from within the traditional labor movement and from these alt movements outside that women are leading. And I think that politics is going to focus to a large degree on how we can move care back into the center of the conversation and make the social and the human more important.
Does anyone else on the panel want to respond at all to that question?
I mean, I'll just say quickly, this seconds, I think what Joanne Maritz and Dorothy Sue were saying earlier about organizations like SIWA and places that are like people organizing outside the United States. Of course, the vast amount of labor that most women do is not in the labor market. And it is mostly in various forms of care. And so when we think about what a movement would look like that would benefit society, it has to reckon with that question as well. And I think about how do you incorporate, and I think, you know, this is an old feminist observation, right? But that the depressive effect on particularly the wages of women of color is that this is a form of labor that is also done in uncommodified forms all over the country and all over the world. And so I think on the one hand, this is the most daunting aspect of organizing. On the other hand, it is potentially the most radical and disruptive aspect of social movement organizing, to really take on the question of what would it mean to have an economy in the service of society. But it's a heavy lift.
So we have another question from Ava Marin, somebody I'm sure Dorothy Sue you are familiar with. And perhaps we can answer this live. Would you like to answer the question or ask the question?
Oh, I can unmute. Hi. Okay, I will ask the question. How did the women highlighted in For the Many disagree on how fast or gradual to push for full or rights or intersectional rights? Was there tension in whether to prioritize gender rights over racial equity?
I'll take a stab at that. Thank you, Ava. Ava is my daughter. And she is helping carry on the tradition of full rights feminism and really cares about the women in this book. And I appreciate her being here today. It's great. A couple of things in terms of tensions of how fast to move. I think the chapter on the 30s is probably one place to dip into. The movement divided. People like Mary Van Cleek refused to vote for Roosevelt. She thought he wasn't being radical enough. She became very disillusioned, at least in the early 30s, about the capacity of American capitalism to change, or the Democratic Party to figure out how to go forward. And she wanted a much more radical solution. She changed her mind over the course of the 30s, and as the Popular Front emerged, she joined with other of the more socially, the social democratic women in the New Deal. Frances Perkins was very crucial here in terms of accomplishing a great deal and being visionary, but both pragmatic. Roosevelt even criticized her for saying she took one bite of the cherry when she might have taken it all, but it's hard to figure those things out. The latter part of your question, I think a really interesting moment is the debate that emerged in 1964 over whether the amendment to the Civil Rights Act to add no discrimination on the basis of sex should be supported. And that was really a debate many people thought of as, should we support, that they had to choose between moving ahead the fight for Black freedom or turning to ending discrimination for women. And of course, those aren't opposed, but it was often conceived that way. And some of the women that I write about have been criticized very intensely by later scholars because they opposed the amendment to add sex discrimination to civil rights legislation, because they thought the legislation would go down to defeat if it had that in it. So that was a difficult moment. And the question of how you prioritize all these really crucial struggles is always with us.
Well, we do have, quite a few, well, not necessarily in the Q&A, but we have a couple of other questions, but we are getting close to the time of the end. And so I'm going to introduce Michael Merrill, who is a longtime colleague of Dorothy Sue, and who also happens to be her spouse.
Thank you, Deborah. Can everyone hear me? Yes. It's fallen to me to sort of be the MC for the last portion of this program. And I want to introduce that portion of the program by saying something about the other Dorothy Sue Cobble. I think most of the people on this panel are here or are at this event are here because of her historical work and her enormous contributions to history. But there's another Dorothy Sue Cobble who has also made enormous contributions to the struggle for workplace justice, for understanding employment relations in the new economy. She was has been quite important in discussions at the most senior levels of various administrations about how to understand employment relations. And that's by virtue of her association over the last 35 years while at Rutgers, not in the history department, but at the School for Management and Labor Relations. And I will speak just from my former colleagues there and my present colleagues at the School for Management and Labor Relations that we've all been immensely honored and intellectually enriched by her association with the school. As I think her history has been informed and enriched by her association with contemporary struggles and with this work. And many people in the history profession aren't aware, I think, of how active and how prominent and how important her work in this area has been. And in honor of that presence, we've invited the Dean of the School for Management and Labor Relations to sort of say a few words about that portion of her work and in honor of Dorothy Sue's long association with the school. So it's my pleasure to introduce Adrienne Eaton, a longtime colleague of mine and of Dorothy Sue's, who is now the Dean, once president of the union at the AAUP at Rutgers, not the usual path to promotion to the deanship of the School for Management and Labor Relations. But we're very proud to have her there, and she's here to say a few words.
Thank you, Michael. Really appreciate that. So I am so pleased to be part of this and to be able to offer a few remarks about my work sister, Dorothy Sue Cobble, on behalf of the school and of the Labor Studies Department, where I was also department chair for many years. So I wanted to start by speaking personally, and I hope that's okay and not embarrassing to either of us, but Dorothy Sue was hired at Rutgers the year before I was, and she was the only woman in the Labor Studies Department at that time, at least as I remember it. And I was hired the next year, and for a while it was really just the two of us assistant professors, the two girls. It was not always a pleasant work environment. Think Me Too here, and I just want to say I really felt supported by Dorothy Sue from the get-go, and it was so important to me to have her there, and I hope she feels the same about me. I have learned an enormous amount from Dorothy Sue's work over the years, as have all her colleagues, and Michael just alluded to that. I share Ruth Milkman's fondness for dishing it out, I have to say, her book on the waitress unions. And I think that book was really, and articles related to it, was really ahead of its time in rethinking models of trade unionism that would work better for service workers, but also for what I would call the new old forms of work that panel members have been talking about, whether you call it non-standard or informal work or contingent work. And it's taken a long time, or it took a long time for the labor movement and for labor scholars to catch up to Dorothy Sue, and kind of related to the question that was asked earlier, and probably many have still not quite caught up. That commitment to exploring new models of unionism is something that the department, I think, has been known for, and it really started with Dorothy Sue's work and has continued with other colleagues, Charles Heckscher, Janice Fine's work on worker centers, most recently Tammy Lee. My recent edited book with Sue Sherman on informal workers and collective action in the developing world would not have been possible without the help of Dorothy Sue's thinking about different ways of advocating and organizing for workers. So of course, she's continued to produce cutting edge scholarship ever since. People have talked about that. And just say quickly, a particular focus on working class women, their feminism, their policy and movement agendas, their leadership, first in the US labor movement and then globally. And I just always really have appreciated her dedication to looking at historic phenomena with new lenses and then reflecting or refracting, whatever the right word is, those lessons learned back to the present, and the asking of difficult questions that have always kept all of us on our toes and been an intellectual inspiration to all of us. A quick word on her teaching. There's a lot that could be said, but I'll just say over the years, I have had many conversations with our professional master's students who found Dorothy Sue's courses, particularly her labor history course, incredibly challenging, but emerged from that experience really proud of what they had accomplished in that course. So I think Dorothy Sue's high standards in her teaching was an incredible contribution to the school. And then last but not least, of course, as mentioned earlier, I think by Debbie Lancaster, Dorothy Sue founded the Center for Women in Work, which has continued to thrive and play an important role in the school and in the university over the last 25 plus years. I think the center has also retained some of its founders' commitment to focusing on the issues of working class women. And I just wanted to say that today's gathering, which was amazing, so thank you all for the presentations, that gathering was really emblematic of the gatherings of people and ideas that were typical of Dorothy Sue's leadership at the center, at the Institute for the Research on Women, and in the department. And as Michael said, so enriching for us all. So thank you, Dorothy Sue, for the chance to work with and learn from you, and for the legacy that you've left at the School of Management and Labor Relations and in the Labor Studies and Employment Relations Department.
Thank you, Adrienne, very much. I have two jobs. One was to introduce Adrienne. The other was to ask Dorothy Sue to get the final and last word here. I want to say, in passing the baton to her, that everyone should know that this is not the curtain is not going to fall on this act. There's already 2 books on the desktop and lots of other things going on, and it's my pleasure to be able to assist and to carry bags and archives whenever I can to help with these projects. But Dorothy Sue, it's to you to say the last words for this event.
Thanks. I'll be brief. I just want to reiterate my thanks to everyone for being here. It's something I'll treasure for a long time, and it's been really a joy. Your remarks. I'm glad there's a recording. We'll let you know how you can get a hold of that. I'll end with some thoughts from our full-right feminist foremothers. They believe the fight for a more just and inclusive world required all the courage, brains, empathy, and solidarity we can muster. So stay safe, everybody, and carry on. That concludes our program. Thanks a lot.